My subject from this evening, and I'll refer to this passage later on, is an unusual one. It is a subject of a Christian view of history, a Christian view of history. Now I'm going to start by asking some questions. How many people study history at school? Hands up. Right, thank you. How many people enjoyed the study of history at school? Oh, that's good. That's encouraging. Good. I'm very pleased about that. Right, I'm going to introduce a few characters. And the first one, John will put up. Anybody know? Now you abandon John. Anybody know who this man is? A famous evangelical bishop of the 19th century. You'd say? J.C. Ryle. Yeah, that's right, spot on. J.C. Ryle, Bishop Ryle. Bishop Ryle had very definite views on history and wrote at least two excellent books in historical periods, the Reformation, English Reformation, and also the Evangelical Awakening in the 18th century. But he made this statement that basically it is a poor man or woman who is ignorant with the history of his or her own country. That's the first statement to remember. Then I want to go on to perspectives, basically, in history. Different people have different perspectives on history. And there's three very contrasting ones now that I want to introduce you to. Now, the first one, John, if you would, this gentleman. Anybody? He's an American, basically between the 19th and the 20th century, who was very famous and basically founded a motor empire. Pardon? Henry Ford, that's right, Henry Ford. Henry Ford's view of history was very dismissive. He just simply said, history is bunk, and that's it. Turn to the second one. I think this might be more difficult. This gentleman was basically an 18th to 19th century German philosopher. Very well known, basically, but some years ago. No, I think it's a hard one. Friedrich Hegel. And what did Friedrich Hegel say about history? Well, he didn't have a dismissive view like Ford, but he had a pessimistic view of history. He said, we learn from history that we learn nothing from history. We learn from history that we learn nothing from history. Then the third one, or fourth in total, is much more realistic, this gentleman. Sir Winston, that's right, Sir Winston Churchill. And I put it in exactly the language that he used. And it turns round Hegel's statement. If we do not learn from history, we are bound to repeat its mistakes. If we don't learn from history, we are bound to repeat its mistakes. So those are perspectives. Now, I attempted a definition of what history is. This is my definition. This isn't obtained from any textbook or anything. I believe that history is a fallible record of God's inscrutable providence exercised in the affairs of men. I'll repeat that. A fallible record of God's inscrutable providence exercised in the affairs of men. And of course, beyond that is the statement of Ephesians 1:11, that God works all things, not most things, but all things, according to the counsel of his own will. At best, it seems a bit trite, but at best, history is God's story at best, as I say. Now, if we can turn to Daniel's dream, let's just start the beginning, first of all, chapter 2 and verse 1. Now, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. But he couldn't remember the dream, unfortunately. And though he offered a great reward to those who could interpret it, verse 6, and a severe sanction for those who couldn't, verse 5, then basically there was no help from those in his own nation, the wise men so-called of Babylon. And his judgment on them started. We have that in verses 12 and 13. For this reason the king was angry and very furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Daniel was part of this wisdom of the nation, was acknowledged to be. So they were in tremendous danger. But God intervened after the prayer of Daniel, verses 20 to 22. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise, and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in darkness, and light dwells within him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to me the king's demands, the interpretation, or the nature and the interpretation of that particular dream. So God was working through the prophet Daniel and granting him his wisdom, the wisdom of his spirit. Now I want to look at the imagery then that is presented here. First of all, verses 31 to 35. This is what the king saw. He couldn't remember, but this is what he saw, and it so frightened him. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay, and you watched while a stone was cut out without hands. So going on to the stone then, 34 and 35, it was cut out without hands, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, its weakest point, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away, so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So we have two metaphors here, two symbols, if you like. First of all, the image, and then the stone. And we have the significance of the stone in verses 44 and 45. And in the days of these kings, the ones that God will raise up, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So the significance of the stone: a small stone which destroyed the image, which became a mighty mountain. And we have an analogy to that in Matthew 13, 31, 32, not a stone this time, but a tiny mustard seed, which became a great tree so that the birds could shelter in it and make their nests. They both are saying forth the same message. So what about the kingdoms? Well, obviously, the first one is identified with Nebuchadnezzar. It's the Babylonian kingdom. It was followed by the Medo-Persian kingdom, and we read a lot about that in the life of Belshazzar, and particularly Belshazzar's dream. The Greco-Macedonian, that is the empire of Alexander the Great, and the Roman Empire, which was actually divided into East and West. So those are the empires which are identified with these various different metals. And I think we can extend this and talk about other empires that we have known in more recent times, just to go through some of them. The Mongol Empire, the Viking Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Soviet Empire, latterly until 1989. And we can also identify with great contemporary countries, economic powers of today, the USA, the Russia, and China. The image and the stone then are symbols, but the image represents kingdoms, but the stone represents a kingdom which will never end. And that, of course, is the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Christ. Now, I'm suggesting to you, and I hope you forgive me for making this connection, but the world's view of history is represented by the image. The world's view of history is represented by the image. Concentration on nations, political powers, dominant religions like Hinduism in India, Muslim in central part of the world and North Africa, empires and wars. That is the concentration. If you read history books, that is the concentration. The focus of Christian is or ought to be on the stone, because that stone eclipses all the other empires and lasts forever. It's God's eternal kingdom that is spoken of in Daniel 2 and 44. And it is being built continually. I know it's a familiar passage, but there's no harm in looking at it again. And that's a passage in Matthew chapter 16, 13 to 18, if we could turn to that and read more about that kingdom. So here's the word to Peter after he confessed that Jesus was the Christ. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So they said, "Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And so often Peter was their spokesman. Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say that you are Peter, and on this rock," not Peter, but the confession that he makes of Christ, "on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." Here is the stone gradually becoming this mighty mountain and eclipsing all the great empires of this world. And that, as I say, ought to be our focus as Christians. Throughout the ages, from Abraham and his call, to dealt with a few weeks ago, this history is basically in two dimensions. First of all, there is biblical history, which is infallible. There's no mistakes made in biblical history, whatever men might say. That is certain. But there's another dimension, that's God's continuing development beyond biblical revelation, and that is fallible and subject to different interpretations. Oh, sometimes, of course, all these things become very mysterious. Sometimes what God is doing can seem like a series of very disconnected events, but leading to a wonderful outcome. Well, the analogy is made with a jigsaw puzzle that we see the pieces of a jigsaw, and God sees the complete picture, and maybe He reveals it to us. I think that's a good analogy, but I'm not too happy with it in some respects, because pieces of a jigsaw can resemble one another, otherwise I wouldn't be able to do them. I like to think of it like this. Being a chemist by training, I'll use a chemical analogy. You take a substance like iron, metal like iron, and you melt it in a furnace, and you add very different elements to it: carbon, nickel, aluminium, cobalt, tungsten. You heat them all up together, stir them, take off the dross, the impurity, and then pour into some sort of crucible. And what do we get? No, we get steel, which is a far better metal than the iron from which you started. Those elements are disconnected. They don't resemble each other. They have very different properties. But what comes out at the end is steel, which is stronger than iron and also more resistant to corrosion. And it's like that. God does those wonderful things, some things that seem not to relate to each other. Now, you may think of better analogies, I'm sure you will, but that's the one I'm coming out with. Just take these pieces, for example. A religious revival in Germany. Now, specifically, Germany didn't exist as a nation at this time in the 16th century. It was Saxony, to be honest, to be strictly correct. We had this man Luther. So a religious revival, Reformation in Germany. A king's desire for a divorce, King Henry VIII. A reduction of power in the church that existed in his country. A nationalization of that church. Now, I'll explain that. Basically, it's not often I will be found quoting a left-wing Labour politician, but one such person was Tony Benn. He's a good, marvellous orator, though I wouldn't agree with his political views. And he was trying to defend nationalisation. And he said, well, there's nothing new about nationalisation. In fact, that's what Henry VIII did. He nationalised the church in this country. And that's precisely what happened. No more, no less. He nationalised the church. And then, finally, two more points. Another point is a young prince's Protestant education. A young prince's Protestant education. Henry was never completely removed from the Church of Rome, but this young man was guided by a Protestant tutor, Sir John Cheek, and he was, in fact, hired by Henry VIII's final wife, Catherine Parr, and we owe a great deal to that lady. But she had both he and his relative, who reigned for 9 days. I'll come back to her in a moment, later on. They were educated in Protestantism. And then finally, a great biblical scholar and translator, William Tyndale. If you take all those elements, what is the outcome of them all together in God's purpose? Well, the answer is the English Reformation in 1547 and following, with the accession of Edward VI. Sadly, he didn't reign long. But all those factors that don't seem to be directly connected, and yet God uses them to produce a result which is glorious. There was no significant doctrinal reforms until that point. But when Edward came to the throne, most certainly there was. So I'm just making that point of what God can do, what God can use, and what he can bring forth. So what about the value then of the study of history? Well, I believe it gives encouragements, particularly in periods of Reformation, revival, and missionary outreach, especially in days like this, days of small things. The great Bible teacher, Dr. Lloyd Jones, used to say, if you feel depressed, then read about Reformation, read about revival, read about missionary outreach, and you will receive blessing in so doing. The fact is, what God has done in the past, he can repeat. There's an important word, and I think it's often neglected in the book of Ezekiel. I will yet be inquired of by the house of Israel to do these things for them. He was going to do it, but part of his providential plan was to encourage the prayers of his people. And it's important that if we want to see revival in this country, that we indeed do exactly the same thing. Pray that God might be pleased to revive his work in the midst of the years. So going back to Sir Winston, we also avoid, or should avoid, making the mistakes of previous times. There is a value. Now, what I've said is not all that much. If you want a further perspective on church history, this little book by Phil Arthur, published by the Banner of Truth, is very, very useful indeed. Just leave that with you. And I want to finish by a short poem, if you forbid, if you allow me to do so. History is myriads of papers and tracts. It all seems a puzzle, a jumble of facts, sorting out empires, wars, and dates, treating the narratives each expert relates. Ought we to withdraw in frustration? No. Rather, we acknowledge the ultimate source. Yearly, God works his purpose